we're going to be looking at the distance formula and the midpoint formula. Now, my distance formula is derived from the Pythagorean theorem, and if I need to find the distance between these 2 points, what I can always do, as long as it's only 2 points, is form a right triangle and then use the Pythagorean theorem, which says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where c is the hypotenuse. So if I had this side be 3 and this side be 4, I could do 3 squared plus 4 squared is equal to c squared. And when I solve that out, I end up getting c is equal to 5. So I would have a distance of 5. Now, when we are using the distance formula, we have to work a little bit differently, because I'm not just going to be told what the side lengths are. I'm going to actually have to find that out. So let's say this point right here has an ordered pair of 4, 7. So on a coordinate graph, it's over 4 and up 7. And this point right here, let's say that has an ordered pair of 2, 12. So it's over 2, up 12. What we have to do now is we have to think about, how can I find those side lengths? Okay, when I'm looking at trying to find the side lengths, I need to think about my x-coordinates first. So I know that this point right here lines up on the x-axis with the 2, because my x-coordinate is 2. This point lines up with the 4. Well, in order to find my distance, I have to take 4 minus 2, which in turn gives me a side length of 2. Then I need to look at my y values. When I look at my y values, this top one lines up with a 12. And this bottom one lines up with 7. So I need to take my 12 minus 7 in order to get my side length, and I find that it's a 5. So now I could use my Pythagorean theorem and do 5 squared plus 2 squared equals c squared. And I would end up getting 29 equals c squared, so my side length is the square root of 29. What I want to do now is look at, well, what happens when we only have x's and y's? So instead of 4, 7, I have x1, y1. And instead of 2 and 12, I have x2 and y2. Well, down here we took 4 minus 2. And if you look at what we have now, 4 is x1. So I'm going to have x1 minus, and then my 2 came from that value, which is x2. So I have x1 minus x2, and that's how I got this number right here. Now if I go over here to my y values, I took 12 minus 7. Well, the 12 was my y2, and the 7 was my y1. I'm actually going to write those backwards just so they match our formula down here. So I'm going to take the difference between my y values. So this 5 squared, instead of being 5 squared, I'm going to write it as y1 minus y2 squared plus, and instead of this 2 squared, I'm going to have x1 minus x2 squared, and that's going to be equal to c squared. Now, in order to solve this, because I just want to know what's my length, well, I have to square root both sides. So when I square root both sides, I end up getting my distance, so my c, my distance here, is equal to the square root of the difference of my x values. I'm just going to put my x values first because that's more of a standard version. So x1 minus x2 squared plus y1 minus y2 squared. And there I have my distance formula. That will work to find the distance between any 2 points. Alright, so here's a problem. It says a triangle has vertices at 3, 7, 6, negative 12, and negative 1, 2. Find all the side lengths and classify it based on its sides. First thing I'm going to do is just do a real quick sketch. So I'm going to put 3, 7 right here, 6, negative 12 down here, and negative 1, 2 here. And I am going to label my points just so they're easier to talk about as A, B, and C. So here's A, there's B, and there's C. it wants us to find all of the side lengths. Well, I'm going to start by finding AB. So what it's asking me to do is find the distance between A and B. So I'm only going to be using those 2 points first, and I'm going to use my distance formula, which says I take the square root of x1 minus x2. So I'm going to take 3 minus 6. And that quantity is going to be squared plus, and then I need to take y1 minus y2. So I'm going to have 7 minus a negative 12 squared. Now you might be wondering, how did I decide which one was x1 and y1 and which one was x2 and y2? It actually doesn't matter. So just assign one of them to be x1 and y1 and assign the other one to be x2 and y2. When I do this math, well, 3 minus 6 is negative 3. Negative 3 squared is 9. 7 minus negative 12 is 19. And 19 squared is 361. When I add those two together, I get the square root of 370. And then I want to check first to see if it's a perfect square. And it's not. Now I'm going to leave it as the square root of 370, but I'm also going to give the decimal approximation. It's about 19.24. Now what I want you to do is I want you to find the distance between B and C, and then find the distance between C and A. You're going to use that same process. So pause the video and find those two distances. Alright, to find BC, I did that here in the green. I subtracted my x values, subtracted my y values, I squared them both. You should never get a negative number when you square this, because anytime you square a negative, it turns positive. So these two numbers should always be positive. And I found D to be the square root of 245, which is about 15.65. Then I found AC over here in the red using the same process. I got the square root of 41, which is about 6.4. Now the second part of this says classify the triangle based on its side lengths. Now if you don't remember this from your geometry, we have 3 classifications of triangles. If all the sides are the same, it's equilateral. If 2 sides are the same, it's isosceles. And if none of the sides are the same, it's scalene. So for this particular one, we have a scalene triangle, because none of our side lengths ended up being the same. Okay, our next formula is the midpoint formula. And what this is dealing with is finding the coordinates for the middle of a line segment. So let's say this line segment, we put on a coordinate graph, and I told you that this was the point 2, 4. And over here we've got the point 8, 5. Well, now in order to find the midpoint, we need to do half of our x distance and then half of our y distance. So if you visualize that triangle here, to get from 2 to 8, I have to go 6 units. Well, half of 6 is 3. So from my 2, I need to go 3 more. So that would put me at a 5. And then to get from, on my y values, from 4 to 5, I have to go 1. Well, half of 1 is a half, so I would have to be up here at 4.5. So my midpoint for this particular one would be over 5, up 4.5 would be that coordinate right here. There is an easier way to do that. And basically what we need to do is we need to find the average of my x's and find the average of my y's. So when we're doing the midpoint, to find the x coordinate, we take our average of our 2 x values, so x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then to find our y value, we do the same thing with our y values. We do the average of our y values. Now what you have to realize is this is always going to be written as an ordered pair. So when you find those 2 values, you're then going to write it as x, y. Maybe we'll put a subscript on there for midpoint. So the x value for the midpoint and the y value for the midpoint. So if I had used these 2 in that formula, take x1 plus x2, well 8 plus 2 gives me 10. Divide that by 2 and I get that 5 that we came up with before. And then my y1 plus y2, 4 plus 5 gives me 9. 9 divided by 2 is 4.5. and that gives me the value we had before. So I would have had a midpoint of 5 comma 4.5. Make sure you always write it as an ordered pair with parentheses. Alright, so here's a practice problem. Find the distance between the 2 points first, then find the midpoint of the segment joining them. So go ahead and pause it and see what you come up with. For the distance formula, I've got that written out here in red. I subtracted my x values, squared them and got 25. Subtracted my y values, squared it and got 225. Added those together and got the square root of 250, which is about 15.81. Now, the 250 you could have broken down into the square root of 25 and the square root of 10 and gotten 5 square roots of 10 also, which is still going to be about 15.81. The midpoint I did over here in the blue. I added my x values together, so I had 9 plus 4 divided by 2, gave me 6.5. Added my y values together, so negative 10 plus 5 divided by 2 gives me negative 2.5. Then I wrote my final answer as an ordered pair, so 6.5 comma negative 2.5.